So I'm here today with Kristy Arbon from Heartworks. Kristy, can you introduce yourself for us, please?
I certainly can. Lovely to be here with you, Victor. So I'm actually an Australian living in the United States, and I work as a teacher of self-compassion and mindfulness mostly. I've worked with Kristy Arbon and Kristin Neff, who developed the Mindful Self-Compassion program. I've been working with them for a number of years, helped them start up the Centre for Mindful Self-Compassion, and I do it because self-compassion and mindfulness are my personal practices, and I love to teach them and share them with other people. So I teach retreat-style mindful self-compassion. I teach it online as well. I do mentoring for people who need support in their mindfulness and their self-compassion practice. I do workshops. I'm starting to branch out a bit more all along self-compassion lines, but as well as mindful self-compassion, looking at how we can practice self-compassion in the body as well. So really focusing on soothing ourselves, physically taking care of ourselves. So I have sort of those two foci, mindfulness and self-compassion in the body.
Nice. So I think that might be my first question, and I'll go to this point. If you could explain for us what's mindfulness and what's self-compassion.
So mindfulness, it's a bit of a buzzword these days, I know, and there are a number of different definitions of mindfulness. And the definition that works for me is the one that comes to me in the moment, which at the moment is mindfulness is an exquisite awareness of our present moment experience without judgment. So it has to have those three components: awareness of our present moment experience without judgment, basically. So it's likened to things like equanimity, to things like spaciousness, awareness. All of these are similar words to mindfulness. But so that's what mindfulness is. Self-compassion is different, even though we do have a program called the Mindful Self-Compassion course. Mindfulness is an awareness of our experience. Self-compassion is an awareness of ourselves as the one having the experience, so the experiencer. Mindfulness might say we hold our experience in a broad sense of awareness. So we're sort of like bystanders for our experience. We're not getting involved in our experience. We're sort of standing back. Self-compassion might have a closer focus. So if we're focusing on the experiencer, the person who's having the experience, we're actually we do have a focus. Mindfulness might be like this. Self-compassion is a bit like this. And there's a leaning in, there's a warmth to it. So it does have a specific focus there. So just on warmth, we sometimes say self-compassion is warming up the conversation, while mindfulness is sort of a cool awareness, so the cool breath or the cool breeze of mindfulness, we might call it. So yeah, very much, like I know I keep doing this, but this is part of my somatic self-compassion experience is mindfulness, and then self-compassion is sort of that.
Okay, that's very nice. I have two questions. I'm gonna start with one that's more personal, and then I go to the other one. Then I think is like more as an explanation for people. Is it okay?
Yeah, great.
So the first question is like, why did you get in contact with mindfulness and then in self-compassion, or self-compassion first and then mindfulness? Why did it come to you?
So mindfulness came first to me. I first practiced mindfulness many years ago, probably 30 years ago. Actually, my very first experience of mindfulness was a very difficult experience. I actually was set a paper to write, or a project to do as part of my Bachelor of Psychology that I was doing at university. And it was around mindfulness. So practice mindfulness, journal about your experience, and then hand that project up, and it went towards your final grade. And I remember being really angry at the professor that I was being asked to do this practice, which I felt like I couldn't do. It's like didn't feel I could do mindfulness. I was failing at it. I had this awful inner critic that told me, you're failing, you're going to fail this course. So I remember being very upset around having to practice mindfulness and have that go towards my final grade. So that was my introduction, but fortunately I stuck with it. So in my 20s, I started practicing in the Buddhist tradition, practicing meditation. I practiced in the Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I think that might have been first. I did some of Thich Nhat Hanh's meditations, so in his tradition, a little bit in the Vipassana tradition, the insight meditation tradition. So really, I experimented with all of these in my mindfulness practice. Then, toward the end of my 30s, and by that time I'd moved to the United States from Australia, got really interested in Vipassana meditation or insight meditation. And my husband and I moved to Massachusetts, to the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And I was the manager there, and he was the facilities manager there. So we were a team. And for about 5 years, we ran the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And I really immersed myself in Vipassana mindfulness practice. It comes from the Theravadan Buddhist tradition, basically. But something was missing. Something was missing in my practice. I had gotten really good at making myself sit on my cushion, being very disciplined around my practice. So I would make myself sit on my cushion, and then, as we say, I white-knuckled it through. It's like I was hanging on to the edge of the mat, like, gee, I wish this 45 minutes would just go. I'm hating this experience. So a lot of resistance, a lot of resisting my present moment experience. A lot of the inner critic was really having a go at me. You know, you've got to sit here for 45 minutes and meditate, or you're a bad meditator. The fact that I was running a retreat centre, also I put the expectations on myself. If you're running a retreat centre, you must have a regular meditation practice. But it wasn't, I mean, sometimes it was lovely, but sometimes it was like this. So the missing piece was self-compassion, basically. And what self-compassion does is, if I find myself like this, then I notice I'm having that experience. I might consciously, relax my shoulders. If I'm like this, I might release into something more like this. I might notice that I'm suffering in that moment and do the, oh, you're feeling really bad right now. You're putting these expectations on yourself. The inner critic is telling you you're doing a bad job. You're making yourself sit here for 45 minutes and you're really uncomfortable. Oh, dear one, that's all really painful. And so I started to bring this into both my meditation practice and into my life in general, so that starting to focus on my experience of suffering and tend to myself when I was suffering, it was quite revolutionary for me, because for many people, mindfulness has a lot of self-compassion in it already. For me, it did not. Mindfulness was just this stand back and watch my experience. So I really needed to add in that self-compassion to tend to myself. And so from there, my life,
my life probably got more difficult before it got easier, as these things sometimes go. So I started this new practice. I made some big decisions about my life, more in alignment with self-compassion, and I continue to this day. I'm still refining my own practice of self-compassion and mindfulness. So I think it's a lifelong practice, that one.
Nice. Actually, while we are talking, pop up in my mind a few more questions, and I want to make so many questions for you. But I think one nice thing to ask is like, so at the beginning of your very first experience, you said
30 years ago.
Yeah, 30 years ago, when your professor said, "Oh, do this," yeah. So he said like this, and then you were very tense in your first experience. At that time, like if you look back now, at that time, do you think you were in any way practicing mindfulness because you were aware that like you were not feeling well and then you didn't believe, or you were not mindful at all? Do you understand me now?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. I think I had some mindfulness there, but what happened, the more overpowering experience was perfectionism and an inner critic. So the perfectionism, basically what my perfectionist side was having a difficult time with was, how do I do this perfectly so I get a good grade, basically? And then the answer is, well, there's no way you do mindfulness perfectly. So I was annoyed at that. I want to know how to do this perfectly because I want a good grade. And then I got very, very confused. My perfectionist side, it felt like it was being set up to fail. My professor is setting me up to fail. So that, and then an inner critic that said, you're doing it wrong, they were the overwhelming experiences that I had. I was aware that I was feeling an inner critic and a sense of perfectionism. Back then, I wouldn't have been able to name it as that. What I was experiencing was a sense of impending failure and anger at my professor. So these were the emotions I was feeling: fear of failure and anger. Underneath both of those, perfectionism and the inner critic, and underneath all of that was basically being afraid that I would be kicked out in some way. So probably some shame in there. Shame, a worry about being kicked out of my class or failing or whatever, or being seen as being a bad student. So shame was underneath all of that. So now I can look at all these layers of processes that were going on. But back then, as I said, just fear of failure and anger, and mostly anger. That was mostly what I was experiencing.
But you were mindful that you were feeling anger, is it?
I'm not sure. I knew I was angry. I don't think I was standing sort of outside of myself and saying, "Oh, that's interesting. Kristy's feeling angry."
Okay.
I was in it. So this would be a nice part of the definition of mindfulness. When I'm angry, if I'm in that experience, if I'm thinking I am angry, I'm an angry person, all of my responses are coming from anger. And anger, we feel very right when we're angry. It's a very powerful emotion. So if we're acting from that place, we're not questioning any of our decisions or our judgment, which we really should do when we're angry.
Mm-hmm.
We're not questioning, we're just sure of our own rightness and we're moving ahead with anger. That's not being mindful. I could be mindful with anger, though. Mm-hmm. So I could say to myself, oh, I'm feeling angry right now. I want to march up to my professor's office and tell him that it's not fair. Like, I want to wave my fists and stamp my feet and do this. How about I just sit with anger for a little while and see what else is happening there? And probably, I don't think I was mature enough at the time. I was 17 years old, so I don't think I was mature enough at the time. But with a more mature mindfulness practice, I would have seen anger, the inner critic, perfectionism, shame, and then somewhere in there, a sense of a negative core belief that I'm unlovable. That would be right at the bottom. So that's what mindfulness would help me do. Self-compassion, when I notice that I'm feeling these things, especially shame or that negative core belief, self-compassion would come in and I would take care of myself. Shame is a really difficult emotion to feel. It's very painful. So if I was feeling that, then I would then take care of myself and respond kindly to that experience.
Nice.
I know that was a long answer to your question.
No, that's perfect. That's very nice to hear. And Kristy, so I think we are talking a lot about compassion, self-compassion especially. And I asked you what's mindfulness and all of this, but how could you define what's compassion or straight away self-compassion?
So compassion is the same whether we're offering it to ourselves or we're giving it to other people. We sometimes call it outer and inner compassion. It's just the direction that you send the compassion, really. But what's happened in a lot of Western culture, or certainly in the United States culture, is people don't know how to offer self-compassion. They're often pretty good at offering compassion to other people, but not so good at offering compassion to themselves. So this is why we have self-compassion skills training programs. There are compassion cultivation trainings as well.
Mm-hmm.
So compassion, there are a couple of components that are required for compassion and self-compassion. So one is mindfulness. So mindfulness is an important part of compassion. We have to notice that something's going on. Either we notice what's going on for ourselves or we notice what's going on for somebody else. So there's an awareness, there's an ability to see things clearly with some sense of equanimity. So mindfulness needs to be there. We need to have a sense of kindness. So kindness to ourselves or kindness to the other person. And this is the piece where people are often very able to be kind to other people, not so much to themselves. So kindness requires the part of mindfulness that is about being non-judgmental. So kindness, we don't tend to be kind and judgmental at the same time. Kindness tends to overlook any judgment we might be holding. We're just there, we care, we're concerned, we want to help out. This is what kindness is. So that's the second component of compassion or self-compassion. And then the third component, and what I'm going through here is Kristin Neff's 3 components of self-compassion. The third component is a sense of common humanity, a sense that I'm not alone in my experience. Also, if it's outer compassion, this comes pretty naturally. We would say to a dear friend, you're not alone in your experience. I had a similar experience the other day. There are support groups that can help you out, all of this. So we would do that, this common humanity for somebody else. Doing it for ourselves, we remind ourselves that we're not alone. Because what we can tend to do is isolate ourselves when we're feeling bad about ourselves and think that we're the only person having a difficult experience. So common humanity is, I'm not alone, other people feel this way, even my loved ones, my friends, they feel this way sometimes. I needn't isolate myself, because isolation is very painful. Self-isolation is very painful.
Nice, perfect. And I think I have a challenging question. So,
Right.
How can you observe that you are judging yourself, and how can you train your mind to don't judge situations, or because this is more or less like what everyone is used to do. You get to something and then you judge this thing. And, oh, this is good, this is bad, I don't feel good, that's terrible to feel like this. How to do this?
So I think we take a step back. We don't go straight to trying to be a person who doesn't judge. Judging is very useful for us. If we couldn't judge a safe situation from a dangerous situation, then we probably wouldn't last very long. So we do need to make these assessments of situations. Very natural for the mind to judge. This is good, this is bad, this is healthy, this is unhealthy. I want this, I don't want this. All of that is fine. So we don't necessarily stop our mind. Certainly initially when we first start a mindfulness or a self-compassion practice, our mind won't stop from having those judgments. Now, I often say to people, you can't control what your mind does. Your mind is going to have these thoughts. It's what we do with these thoughts that's really important. So, if a thought came up, if I was thinking about myself and I thought, oh, that was a stupid thing that you did. You're a stupid person. Why did you do that? I might start to have that thought, partly because I've been having that thought my whole life. Maybe someone early on in my life, an early caregiver, used to talk to me like that. And so I internalize that way of talking to myself. So I tell myself I'm stupid. But what I do with mindfulness is I notice that I've just done that. I notice that I've just called myself stupid. And then I bring a little curiosity to that. Oh, I've just said you're stupid. And I'm a little bit interested in that, rather than identifying immediately with, oh my goodness, I'm so stupid. We step back and go, oh, I've just said that I'm stupid. And then, so we might just look at it with curiosity for a little bit. If we notice that we're feeling some suffering, some pain in our body, and this is usually how suffering shows up in our body. We get tightness in our throat, or a clenched feeling behind our sternum, or our stomach hurts, or we have a headache or a neck ache. If we notice any of these things, then this is the time we can bring mindfulness, but also self-compassion to that. So we might even put a hand on the heart. Oh, you've just experienced someone, yourself, telling yourself that you're stupid. That's really painful to hear that kind of way of speaking to yourself. So bringing some kindness to that. So that's how we would start with all of that inner, the way that we talk to ourselves. We would start with the mindfulness piece, the self-compassion piece, and we'll find that over time we will actually have less of this critical talk, both for ourselves and for other people. I'm a strong believer in, if we do the work for ourselves, the self-compassion work for ourselves, it will naturally flow on, because we tend to judge other people as harshly as we judge ourselves. So if we learn to judge ourselves less harshly, we will automatically judge other people less harshly. So this is why we call it a practice. We can't go straight to being that non-judgmental, that lovely image of the Buddhist monk sitting cross-legged with not a worry and not a judgment in their mind. We don't go straight to that. We might get glimpses of it, which is really nice in our practice. But over time, we get more and more glimpses, more and more of these moments of awakening, of enlightenment, where we don't have these difficult thoughts. The more we practice, and this can take this can take years, but the more we practice, the more of those non-judgmental moments we feel, more equanimity, more care for ourselves, and so we turn that state that we achieve in a meditation practice into a permanent trait throughout our life. But we've got to work at it. There's no pill we can take for that one.
Nice, perfect. And as you were talking, it means that mindfulness comes before self-compassion, at least the way that you get to know yourself. So if you would talk to a beginner, would you recommend them to do, for example, a 8-week course before the person goes to self-compassion training, or it really doesn't matter?
It does matter, and it depends on the person, really. For a lot of people, doing a mindfulness course first is a really lovely idea. For some people, when they bring mindfulness to their experience, they go straight to suffering. because that is the underlying experience that they're having. And these are usually people who have some sort of trauma in their history, developmental trauma or shock trauma, something that comes from their childhood, or maybe a more recent shock trauma. So anyone who's had trauma, the minute you say, all right, stop and be with your experience, even just for 5 minutes, they might be immediately triggered because they go straight to that difficult experience.
Mm-hmm.
So for those people, self-compassion first would be the way to go. Learning how to self-soothe first, so that when we bring in mindfulness and we go straight to that difficult memory or that difficult body experience, we move immediately to self-soothing, to take care of ourselves. So yeah, they're the people who maybe should do self-compassion first, and then they might like to deepen into their mindfulness. So it really depends on the person.
That's very nice. And you also said, like, many times you said, like, oh, okay? Like towards yourself. So this feeling of, because there is like a big confusion in, I think, between this to something like you are. I don't know how to explain this very well actually, but like that's a difference of victimism, for example, and self-compassion. Yeah, self-pity. That's the word.
Yeah.
And so, what's the real difference between these things?
Yeah. So yeah, self-compassion is confused with a lot of different things, like selfishness, like self-pity, like arrogance or narcissism or laziness. All of these things. We call these the misgivings of self-compassion. Mm-hmm. People think, if I'm self-compassionate, one of these things is going to happen to me. I'll no longer be I'll no longer take responsibility for my actions because I'm just going to love myself, whatever I do. So with the self-pity piece, the reason why self-compassion is different to self-pity is because what self-pity does is it says, woe is me, I'm all alone, I'm the only person that has this experience, I feel really bad for myself. Self-compassion says, I am not alone in my experience. It gives us this sense of, we keep some perspective. Other people have this experience. Other people have experienced a lot worse than this experience. Inevitably, many people have experienced a lot worse than this. And there are tools to use to take care of myself. I can keep some perspective on this. So that's the difference. It's really around the common humanity piece. I'm not alone, whereas self-pity says I am alone.
Okay, that's very nice. Thank you for all the explanations.
Great.
Kristy, our last question, or maybe two last questions. One, if every Brazilian were listening to us right now, what would you tell them?
What would I tell them? I would tell them I love Brazil first. And well, maybe can I turn that question back to you? What do you think is the biggest thing that Brazilians suffer from in terms of emotional suffering? What do Brazilians need to have addressed?
You got me now. I can feel that I'm hot over here. I'm not really sure, but I think like self-compassion is a thing that we still don't have really this understanding over here, and we see people, like almost everyone, with these talks, like, wow, I'm really stupid and I don't do anything right. I would say that that's the really good reason of our conversation, if we can show this to people, because the idea is like, don't say, if you say that to yourself, be aware of that, and check if that's the way that you want to treat yourself, or if like you can do something different for you, and how would you like to approach yourself and in this way? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So, all right. So my message to Brazilians is, Brazilians, dear ones, you are totally worthy of kindness and compassion. Whatever you've done in your life, you were doing the best you could at the time. I know this. This is the reality. We're doing the best we can in any moment. We can learn from what we've done, and we can move forward to being kinder and more compassionate to ourselves. And we needn't have this inner critic telling us that we're bad. We can actually have a dialogue with this inner critic, and this inner critic, it will quieten down over time. That is my promise if you practice mindfulness and self-compassion.
That's great. And Kristy, would you like to tell us about your company or something like that?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So my business is Heartworks Training, and I actually offer 3 different things. So Mindful Self-Compassion, the program that Chris Germer and Kristin Neff developed, I teach that in all sorts of different ways. 5-day courses, I think I said this at the start, online. I do workshops as well, 1-day, 2-day workshops. So I just love that program. I love teaching it. So Mindful Self-Compassion. I also teach people how to cultivate their contemplative practice. So if they have a mindfulness practice or a self-compassion practice, one of the tricks, one of the difficult things can be, how do I practice this every day? How do I get a habit of doing this thing every day? So I help people to do that. I have a course that I teach. I have an online program, and I also do mentoring for people. So I meet with people one-to-one to support them in their practice. And often what we work on are things like the inner critic. How is the inner critic sabotaging their practice? And we work with that. So that's 2. And the third one, which I just touched on, and I'm just starting up, I'm very excited, is somatic self-compassion. So this is where mindful self-compassion is more about the mindfulness piece. Somatic is, it really focuses more on the self-soothing, on movement, on restorative yoga, on music, all of these things. So that's something I'm developing at the moment, working with archetypes and inner parts. So it's quite a different focus for self-compassion. So yeah, that's what I do, and I love it. It's my day job.
That's very nice. Okay, Kristy, thank you very much for the conversation, and I'm pretty sure all the Brazilians will enjoy our talk.
Lovely. It's been lovely to talk to you, Victor. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.